Good evening, IEPPV, and welcome to the follow-up webinar from the Night Photography Workshop. During this workshop, I will take you through the thought process that I went through for creating the image of the sea serpent from all the various different source images that we light painted in the evening. I'm Nick Smith, I'm the president of IEPPV, and once again, welcome. Okay, so I am going to start off by sharing my screen, and I'm going to share a complete desktop. So you should now see Photoshop. I'm actually going to step back to Lightroom. And here you'll see a number of the images that I started out with. I've already culled some of the ones that were just utterly horrible, because some of them, that's always happens. So we've got a bunch of different images here. And if I just go through them briefly, you'll see this one was taken just as the sun was setting, so we've got a nice blue sky. And I kept that one intentionally so that we've got some color in the sky. Then we get into the first of the red painted, some of the ones painted with a regular white LED. And so we work through. And you'll see along the way there are various different works, like here I was pointing the flashlight back at the cameras, so we see extra bits. But as you can see, we're slowly assembling all the different parts of the beast, and they are largely in the same place. Now, they're only largely in the same place because along the way, my camera did get jogged, and so we may have to do a little bit of alignment when we pull them into Photoshop just to get everything sorted. This was my attempt to paint a beach ball, and well, yeah, it was a good attempt, but I'm not sure we'll be using that. And then here was, someone came up with the right idea of giving him a ruff or a collar, so we tried that as well. But it gives you an idea that we can have lots of fun and games. Now, this is the final image I ended up with. I'm going to go through the process of recreating something approaching that image. And I've selected a variety of images. These are just the ones that are flagged. Oops, no, I didn't do that. Now, one of the things I did do earlier, which is causing some confusion, is I stacked this set of images. And if you're not familiar with stacking, I'm happy to talk about that offline, but it's a way of collecting images together. So first we'll deselect everything. I'm going to select everything up to that guy. And then I will include him only because I might possibly need some of his bits of red. And this is the most important step. Open, edit the images, and you go open as layers in Photoshop. This is the really critical step. At this point, there will be a short pause while my poor old aging computer thinks. Essentially what this does is to open up each of the separate images in the same file, but as a separate layer. And it's a very powerful technique that's used both for this type of light painting, but also for focus stacking, for panoramas and so on. And it's just a quick way to get everything into a single file in Photoshop. You can, of course, open them up individually and drag them across, but this saves a lot of time. And at this point, I'm talking to take account of the fact that the computer is rather slow. These are also rather large images. Bear in mind, each one of these is a 42 megapixel raw file. So please bear with my aging iMac. Just while this is going, once we've got these loaded, I will start by aligning the images as best I can. Now, given that there's not much of the subject visible in some of these, I probably won't be able to use the Photoshop Auto Align. So I'm going to show you a technique that I use for manually aligning images. The one thing that we can be sure of here, at least pretty sure, is that the lens didn't change. I mean, nobody touched the lens and re-zoomed it, so I didn't change focal length. It didn't change position by more than an inch or two, but it's possible that it just got jogged as we groped around in the dark and somebody else operated my camera for me. So we should have minimal amount of realignment, and it should be just a matter of just sliding the images back and forth and just possibly rotating them a teeny bit, although I think even that's very unlikely. As we come along, you'll see that there are a few things that we may want to do when we're finished with the image. One of them is remove that rock and the post that's supporting that. Bright rock is really distracting, so I definitely think I'll be taking that out. And then the post that supports him is a necessary part of the sculpture, but unfortunately a bit of an eyesore, so I think we'll take that out. And then there's a third rock next to the second and third coils that I also find a little bit distracting, so I think we'll probably take him out. Now that the images are loaded, if you'll see up here, you can see all of them loaded. And one of the things that Photoshop does, for reasons best known to itself, is it loads them in a strange order. It loads them with the oldest file at the top. I generally find that to be a little annoying because typically I build images from a base. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to Layer, Arrange. I've got all of those layers selected, and I'm going to reverse them. This now puts the last one that I shot at the top of the stack, and the first one I shot at the bottom. And I'm now going to go and switch all of the layers off except for the bottom one. So this image was taken really not with intent of using the body of him at all, but just for the sky. If I pull in the next image, first thing, if you see, you can see there's a teeny hint of movement, not massive. So I'm going to switch this layer into screen mode. I'm going to zoom into 100% and then just take a look and see what my alignment's like. And if you look around here, you'll see that we're just slightly off. So what I'm going to do is just nudge this layer with the nudge tool, just using the cursor keys. And if you look, you can see him coming in. And the first thing you notice is that it starts to line, but it hopes going the wrong way. But the second is that when you get the alignment, suddenly the image looks much sharper. And I think that's it. So now we can put this layer back into, I'm going to put it into Lighten Mode. I'll talk about the different modes in a second. So Lighten Mode is an interesting mode. It basically shows anything on the layer above that is brighter than the equivalent pixel on the layer below. So if you're doing star trails, it's the perfect way to show them. If you're doing something like this, it's a great way to see them because you can see the image will just get progressively get brighter and we only see the bright bits. Now we bring in the next layer, and again we see that there's a significant shift on this layer, so we're going to go through the same things to switch it into screen, and then make sure that layer is selected, and just gently nudge until it lines up. And if you notice, suddenly it becomes sharp, and it no longer looks blurred. And I think that's about it there. Yep. So switch him into Lighten. And start with the next one. Okay. We're still slightly off, so let's move him as well. And at this point, the expression rinse and repeat comes to mind. And that, I think, is it. You know what? Let me put him into screen mode rather than Lighten. So screen mode shows you them both through. I don't know the exact math behind the layer, but it allows you to see both layers together. It's similar to Lighten in that it does show the lighter pixels, but you get to see a lot more of the layer below in it. So it's ideal for this type of movement. And just a quick check. We still look to be pretty sharp around here. And so looks like we don't have anything other than just you know, a slide. We don't have any rotation involved in the shift. Okay. And one other thing I noticed, bear in mind that we were taking 30-second exposures on a longer lens, probably about a 40 or 50 millimeter lens. You'll notice the stars are not dots; they're little dashes, which would be the beginning of a star trail if that's what we wanted. But since we don't, I will probably take those out in that they're distracting. And then the other thing is it looks like we've got some sensor dust. So again, we'll take some of that out when we get to it. Okay, now we get to one of the darker layers where we've only got small portions of it visible. And so again, put that one into Lighten mode. Put the next guy into screen mode. And again, we're off. So we just bring him in. I don't know whether the webinar will show you enough detail to see how the sharpening that happens when you get it lined up. There it is. There it is. Bang. But suddenly it comes into crystal, sharpness. Okay. And whoa, that one's off by a significant amount. You can see the shift very quickly as I do this. So again, switching to screen. Now, if there's enough of the image visible, Photoshop does an excellent job of doing this lot. But in a case like this, where there's only parts of it visible because we line painted, it's just quicker. Rather than have Photoshop try and get it wrong and then just get frustrated, I just go straight to this tool. It's simple, it's quick, and it really doesn't take very much effort. This one's a hard one because it's such a dark layer. So now what I'm doing is I'm looking down here. You can see where it's appearing in the sky, and so we'll just shove it back until it gets out of the sky. And then we'll... I can't see where we are vertically. I suspect we're not going to use very much of this layer just because it's not really very visible. But there again, this may be part of the tail. Let's see what we've got down here. No. Not sure if that layer actually adds us anything. So we might just ignore him. Let's go back to normal. No, maybe might want to use some of this up here because this was the one where we painted in the horns. So again, let's go up to the horns, see what we can see, and use that bit for alignment. There we go. Now you can see the difference. Okay. That I think is it. Lighten. Now we're not going to end up leaving all the layers in Lighten, but I do use Lighten so that I've got something. I don't know that we're going to need this layer because it's all a bit dark. Oh, we might as well lighten it up and align it anyway. Yeah, that's going to be tricky. Bring it to screen. Now, where I'm looking is around here. This is where you can see the visible difference. If you see it's just sneaking in there. With a layer like this, it does get a little tricky. Okay. Next. Now we go back to, for those of you that are Mac users, Command 0 takes you to the full view and Command 1 takes you to 100% view. That's how I'm able to switch very quickly. Now that we're looking at the coils back here, we don't have a lot of information back there, so alignment, but immediately as soon as I do this, you can see the alignment versus the original image that we put in right at the beginning. So again, our alignment becomes pretty simple. And we're just going to come down there. Again, just looking at the edge of the coils, and that looks to be it. Next one. Okay, this one, I remember this layer as being a little bit too hot, so probably not going to use them, but again, just for completeness. Again, looking up here, because that's where you can see the difference. And that looks to be... I think that's the one. And now we're getting right to the far end. And we'll switch them into screen mode. Oh, and we can see the difference very quickly.
Nick, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, Rebecca.
So, I think you have like 14 layers, and I understand, it probably cleaner to align it first and also let you have a chance to study what you have and what you don't have.
Yep.
But would it make sense to kind of go through it and actually really study what parts you want before you align them, or
Sure.
you know
Absolutely. You can. I mean, you don't have to align them first. I like to align them only because that way, when I decide I want something later, I know everything's aligned, and I don't end up bringing in a layer and then wondering why things look odd. I've spent enough time battling with layers misaligned that I find it's easiest just to do this. But I mean, as with, with Photoshop, all things in Photoshop and Lightroom, there are a million ways to do things. Everyone has their own particular way. This is only my way. It's not necessarily the right way. It's just the way that I happen to have developed. That works for what I do, and my workflow. But no, you're absolutely right. You can do it entirely.
but basically someone can actually start with one and then bring in each piece and then align it there.
Absolutely, yeah,
Right.
yeah. The alignment. I mean, you need to do the alignment before you start creating a mask, because otherwise your mask is going to be off. But that's the only thing that's critical. I mean, whether you align them all first and then decide, mask in the bits that you want or not, that's really just down to personal preference. And when you get to these last few, it does get a bit tricky because you've got so much information already in there that it's a matter of just hunting around until you find some place where you can see the alignment. Now, if it's a bigger image, I mean, if it's like a star trail, or if it's a landscape or whatever, then or even I like the stuff that Dave does with Dave Swanson does with architecture. Those are really easy. You can get Photoshop to do all the work because you're not worried about only having very small portions lit. It's just that in an image like this, if you look at the individual layers, some of those layers have only got 5% of the image lit. And so Photoshop really doesn't have enough to be able to work on. And that's why I do this approach for this type of image. If ever I can have Photoshop do the work for me, I'll always do that because it's quicker and easier. Okay, now that we've got everything into into alignment, I'm going to switch all of these layers, select them all, and switch them back to normal. And then I'm going to turn them all off. And oh, no, it looks like I missed some. Okay, scratch that. Let me just bring this guy in. Let me just finish aligning. Okay, so this is where we went back and started painting in some of the highlights. I'd forgotten about this one. And again, this is a layer that I probably am going to use. Now, one thing to comment, each time I do this, and each time any of us do this, we're always going to think slightly different to different time of day and so on. So I can't guarantee I'll end up with exactly the same image that I produced last time. It'll be materially similar, but it may be subtly different, and that's just because of the fact that it's a different day. I'm playing with different bits, and I'm looking at different things. So now we're looking for the tail. There it is, the tail. And again, switch it into Lighten Mode. And let's see how we're doing. I think that's too far out of focus to even be worth looking at, to be honest. Oh no, I don't think I've got that elsewhere, do I? Yeah, no, I do need that bit. But so the other way that you can do it, sometimes you have to do that, is to do this and just switch the layer off and on. And there we are, now we're aligned. Okay, what have we got there? Ah, yes, now this bit was when I used the tungsten balanced LED. And so it created a different color, added some warmth to it. And I know I used that in my final image before, so I'm definitely going to make sure we line this. And I did that to create some, differentiation between the front and back, and it just created a nice sort of warm background glow. So I thought it just told the story a little nicer. And there we go. Good. Okay, and then finally, oh yes, the rough. Well, just for completeness. And you can see some more center dirt back there. So we'll obviously have to deal with that. Now, the one thing about center dirt, we can be pretty certain that it's everywhere. So if it's in one frame, it's probably in all of them, and I'll show you how I fix those later. This is a trick that actually I learned from a real estate and architectural photographer. But I use it heavily in my portraits and really anywhere else that I'm editing, and it's really cool. We'll get to it in a minute. Okay. Let me just switch that to screen and see that, make sure. Oh, no, we're still off. There we go. Cool. Again, it just popped into focus as soon as you do that. So now we're going to go down to here and switch everyone back to normal and then turn everyone off. In case you're not aware, there's a useful trick. If you hold your mouse and just slide up the line of layers, you can turn them all off very quickly. So that's how I did that. Okay, now we start taking a look at the parts that we want, and I take an additive approach. So the first thing is the only shot that I've got where the ground is even remotely useful is this one. So I'm going to use this ground. My first reaction is this ground is very cold. So I'm actually going to, before I do anything, I'm going to stick in an adjustment layer, and I'm going to put in a photo filter, and I'm going to warm it up by some amount. Okay, I'm not worried about that. And we can warm it up by as much as we like. That's probably too much. But if I bring that up to about there, then to get just a little bit more warmth, I'm also going to put an adjustment there and brighten up the whole of the background a bit. And exposure. I'm going to turn the warmth off because I want to see the sky as well. Bring the sky and the ground up to about there. That seems a reasonable sky. I'll probably take that down a bit later. And there's our warmth. Now with this guy, I'm going to make the mask go black, and I'm going to start painting in with a brush. Now this is where a Wacom tablet is an absolute godsend. I've switched my fill color to white over here. I'm painting into the mask, and I'm painting at 100%. And now I can just start painting in, and suddenly my ground gets nice and warm. And this can be fairly general because I really don't care too much. I don't mind if the distance goes blue. In fact, we might let the mountains stay blue because they're in the distance. I just want the foreground to be a little warmer. Okay, we're not worried about him because he's going to get replaced. There we go. I'm not too worried about those. At least that way I've got just a little bit of warmth to the ground so it doesn't look like he's really out in the cold. And then we'll get rid of that. And away we go. So now we step on to the next one. And at this point, again, not sure, I'm going to come back to that layer. I want to start with the main structure of the dragon. And I'm going to pick this guy here. This guy is one, I really like the teeth on this one. I think that's a good one for the face. Now, if I remember, we may have another one up here where, here's where we brought in a little bit more of the teeth, so we'll come back to that one. But we're going to start off with this, and at this point, I'm now going to put in a dark layer mask. So I'm going to hold the Option on a Mac and click the Add click on that layer, hold the option and add layer mask. And that adds a black layer mask. It automatically adds it with the foreground color rather than the background color. Now I'm going to switch to white and I can start painting him in. And sure enough, there he is. And he starts to appear. Now what I'm also going to do is I'm going to switch him into lighten mode because I know that sky is very dark. And magically the sky disappears. The only thing that I see, let me switch my, so this little button up here puts the tablet into proportional size mode, where the harder I press, the bigger the button, the nib gets. This one puts into proportional pressure, where the harder it gets, the denser it gets. So I'm going to switch into denser mode for a while, start painting him in. And I know we haven't got much there, but we've got a good starting point here. We're going to deal with that rock later, so we can just paint that in for a moment. And there we go. Now I've got a little bit of light spill onto the ground. I think I'm going to get rid of that. I might bring some of that back later, but for the moment, we're just going to have him be painted. And then we take a look for the next layer. And the next one comes up as here's where, this is one of the red tongues. I think this is the one I used for the eye. So let us use this. I'm going to zoom into 100%. Again, hold the command, hit the key. Whoops, wrong layer. Hold the command, hit the key, and I've got a blank layer mask. And now what I can do is make my mouse really small. And because I want a sharp edge around the eye, I'm going to put my hardness up to about 80%, which will give me a much sharper edge. And now I'm going to go to the variable size pen, and I've switched off the variable pressure. So you'll see that as I push, my pen gets bigger. And very quickly I can get pretty close to the shape of the eye in one hit. But I overshot a little bit, and that's okay, because I'm going to reverse it, and now I'm going to zoom in, and this is where you start to pixel peep. And I'm now in subtract mode, so I've got X. I'm just going to paint black in, make it a little smaller, so get a bit more control. Let's get rid of this. And switch back to white, and you'll see that I've got my finger over the X key. The X key switches colors, and pretty quickly we can get that eye bang on. It's always better to slightly overpaint and then take off the edges, just because it's easier to do that. And with the practice, you'll get the hang of which ones work better and which ones work worse. What have we got here? Yeah, we don't want any of that, so then we can go there. Now you go back to 100%, and we've now got our nice red eye. So now we're going to come around to the tongue, and we can do the same deal. Just start to paint it in. And where am I? Now then, this is not coming in very bright. Why is this not coming in very bright? My layer is in normal mode. My opacity. So at this point here, my opacity got down to 10%, so I'm going to turn my opacity back at 4%. Full. Go back onto my layer. There we go. Now we've got a nice bright red tongue coming in. Again, switch it into lighten mode. And that should, you know, that's not going to work because some of the red is darker than some of the white. So again, with the blending modes, you have to just play around and see what works and see what doesn't. So at this point, I'm going to have to just basically do it the hard way. And choose to paint in around there. Now, those of you that are mask whizzes will say, well, why don't you use a mask? And you absolutely can use a mask. It's not my core strength. I find that, to be honest with this stuff, it's just easier to paint. But there's certainly something to be said for selecting him, extracting him, and then painting within that extraction. And again, it's just a matter of personal preference as to how you do it. I don't always do this, but this is my general preference. Okay. And so it goes. Now, at this point, I could carry on and process the whole thing, but this is going to get fairly tedious watching me doing this. So what I'm going to suggest is that I do a Blue Peter moment. That's an English thing. Years ago, there was a kids show called Blue Peter, and they would start making something, and then they'd say, "And now here's one that we made earlier," and they'd go from what looked like sort of 2 toilet roll tubes and a packet of cornflakes to suddenly a completely built castle. It was always great fun, but the kids never had any idea of how they did things. So I'll try not to do that, but let me switch over to what I built before. Now that was the finished image. Here were the pieces, and I'm going to show you the bits that I assembled. So the first thing I did was I warmed the ground, and then I added in the red. Looks like I did a red layer here, and I just masked out the ground, and I used the mask that I created from the ground just to add that in. Then looks like I added in some bits of the white of the white painting. And this is the big one. This is where I started to add in all the teeth and the tongues and so on. Now we get into the tongue and the mask. And this is the bit that I didn't want to have to reproduce because it takes time. You can see that I've picked that same layer. The other thing I've done, and this is an important thing if you're working on an image like this, is I've named the layers. And I do that so that I remember why it is that I'm working on a particular layer. Now in a case like this, it's fairly obvious, but in some cases it's not. And the naming of it allows you to come back to an image sometime later and remember what you were doing. So for instance, here I've got this one labeled as face light. And I just had a note from Dave. Let me just send a note back to him saying, yes, we are. Actually, Rebecca, can you just do me a favor and text Dave and say, yes, we're still on Zoom? Dave Swanson.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll take a short pause. Now what I've done here with this one is I've created a group, and I've grouped the red tongue, and I created the mask. So I originally created the mask on the tongue. Then I added an exposure layer to adjust the exposure. And you see I just took it, it was a bit too bright, so I just dialed it back, created a group, and moved the mask up to the group. So what happens is everything within that group gets covered by that mask, and it's an easy way to be able to create a mask once and use it for lots of things. If I wanted to change the color, I could have done that and so on. And I can also switch the whole thing off, so I can go to a white mask if we wanted. But it's an easy trick, and that's a trick that I do a lot of the time. Once you create the mask on a layer and then move it up to a group and apply any adjustments I want within that group. Makes life a lot easier for processing. So now if we step up to the next one, we've got, this was the layer where we added in the top of the horns. And for those of you that were actually there, you'll remember that Kip called out that we hadn't really ever exposed those properly, so we came back and lit those later. And that's an important thing with light painting, is you have to remember which bits of the subject you have done and which you haven't, or go back and look through all of your images in camera and say, okay, it looks like I've got a gap here. Because you can always go and add something in, you can always go and paint it. But going back and recreating the scenario on another day is difficult. It's sometimes impossible. It's certainly a nuisance. So it's better to have too many images than too few. And as you can see here, you don't have to use them all. You can throw a bunch of them away, which I do on a routine basis. As I mentioned during the workshop, this technique is equally applicable to architecture. And you can use it to light paint complete buildings. It's a great way for lighting up buildings at night if you don't have the ability to get a large amount of light to them. And you can create some really beautiful sort of architectural shots from it. Good for churches and old buildings and so on. not so much for office buildings, although I guess you could. So again, here we just we used the warmer light to light up his ear, and now we're getting towards the back of the image. And now this was the light that was a tungsten balanced LED, so you'll see that it's now got a warmer color. It creates an interesting balance. It creates some more shape and dimension to the face. With this layer here, this was the bit, the layer that was lighting up the left-hand side of the coil. That original layer was very bright, and so I actually adjusted that layer before bringing it in to bring the intensity down. It was way, way too bright before, so now it's a little better. And then we get down to the tail, and we finally get to the bits in the far distance. So now now that we've got, essentially we've assembled the major pieces of him, I applied a curves layer to start to enhance the colors and so on. And then okay, and then I brought a layer in that doesn't seem to do anything. That can happen, and it didn't label it, so I don't know why I did that. Yeah, so this next layer up here is where I brought in some more of the warmer light. If you see, it's very subtle, but it's just down here on the back of the neck, and it just creates a little bit of warmth. It's a little bit more shape and form to him. I think this might have been something similar. Hard to tell what I was doing with that. And then this is the final one. This is the trick that I learned, as I say, from architectural photography. It's called a fixed layer. Now, it's essentially you just create a brand new layer that is empty right on top, and then you apply all of the fixes that you want to that layer. So if you're using the clone tool, or if you're using the patch tool or the healing brush, then apply those, no, beg your pardon, not the patch tool, but if you're using the clone tool or the healing brush, or if you're painting in specific bits and pieces, then by putting it into this fixed layer, you apply all the fixes one place without damaging the layers below, but also you do so without making your file enormous, because this file layer ends up empty and only has a few little bits and pieces in it. If you look at it just on its own, it looks kind of funky, because it's just, let me get rid of all of this lot. It's just got little patches all over the place. But that's, now you can see all the little bits and pieces I went and fixed and where I fixed them. And, and nothing that was in the rest of it. So here's where I was getting rid of the post and getting rid of the rock and getting rid of the rock. And then these are stars, and I'm sure somewhere in there was the sensor dust and a few little bits and pieces. But it's very efficient on file size and memory. And it's also, kind of a nice way to work. And the nice thing about it also is if you screw something up, you just get the erase tool out and erase it, and it'll go away. So that layer, you can see all the stuff I did. I took out a hotspot up here. I took out that rock. I took out that rock. I took out this post. I took out that little star. Now, normally I would love to leave stars in, but I don't want stripes. I want stars. It's an English thing, maybe. But so at that point, now I've got the beast pretty much complete. And here's where I finished it off. I'm going to close that. I'm not going to save the changes to it now, and I'll show you what I was doing here. So if I go back to my main image, I had converted all of that lot into a smart object. So that file that we just worked on is the smart object. And I then applied a filter to it using the NIC filters, using the Color Effects Pro. And there's two reasons for doing that. First is because I can pull this thing apart and edit it independently. Doesn't make my file any smaller, but it does give me a file where I haven't got any of the effects and adjustments. I've just got stuff that makes up the image. But the second is that when I apply the filters, they get applied as what's called smart filters. So they actually get calculated on the fly, and I can go and change the effect afterwards. If I want, I can double click on this guy, open up NIC Color Effects Pro, and change my mind. And if you, I don't think we're on the update today. If you don't do that, then once you've applied the NIC filter, it creates a new layer that is cast in stone. So if for no other reason than that, this is worth doing. Not every filter will apply as a smart filter, but most of them will, and it's a really, really useful technique. As I say, for editing them. And Nick just warns you that you're working as a smart object. I could switch this off. I always leave it there. It's a useful reminder. So you'll see that the effect I applied is the tonal contrast effect, and that's a wonderful effect within Nick. It applies contrast in a variety of different levels, so you can adjust the contrast differently between highlights, midtones, shadows. Saturation contrast, you can adjust the type of contrast. And then there are some additional controls that I don't use where you can use it to recover shadows and highlights. And you can actually apply it selectively across the image using the control points. So this is all in the Nick software that is actually now owned by DxO. I'm going to cancel that because I don't want to change it, but that gives you an idea. The final thing that you can do is, if I click on here, there we go, is I can actually change the density of the layer, so I can reduce the effect, and I can also create a mask, and so I can apply the effect selectively. I could, for instance, mask out a portion of this and remove the tonal effect, the tonal contrast from certain portions of the image, or I could paint this all black and then just apply it selectively to certain pages. So there's real benefits to doing that. It does make your file just a little bit bigger, but the control it gives you is enormous. Okay, the next set of layers were where I was playing with the beach ball, and the beach ball really wasn't very successful, but I'll show you what I tried to do. Okay, oh, there we go. So this is kind of what I was playing around with, and I really was fairly underwhelmed, so in the end I switched it off. But the first thing I did, let's get rid of all this junk. And we'll come down here. The very first thing I did with the beach ball was, if I just disable his layer mask for a moment, come on. No. No. I want that disabled. Okay, there'll be a short pause. Let me go and find my mouse rather than my stylus. Okay, I don't know why that doesn't want to. No, apparently I cut the beach ball out and didn't put anything else in it. So, never mind. I originally masked it, but I must have then applied the mask. That's why it didn't work. So you see that the original beach ball, and what I had done was I took one of the messy beach balls and then I just deleted all of the stuff across the edge. You can still see some remnants of where it was, but I tried to create something that was approximately the right shape. And then I applied some effects to it, curves, and I decided I wanted to apply some colors and some more colors. And then I applied exposure to kind of give it a hot spot, to give it a light that was in line with light on the beach ball, and it was still a mess, so then I switched the whole thing off. Anyway, be that as it may, that's kind of the thought process. Your mileage may vary, but I didn't like the beach ball. I had another fixed layer here. There's only minimal fixes, but it was just I found some more stuff. And again, exactly the same thing. It's just a very simple layer. It's got almost nothing in it. And then the final thing is I just applied some local adjustments. I decided this was still a bit bright, so I used a curves layer just to pull it down a bit and bring it back in shape. And then I applied a vignette, just lightening up everything except the corners. So we get, just lighten our image up a bit. And that pretty much was it. The final change that I made before I printed it, which is not in this one, is I then applied an exposure adjustment, and I pulled the exposure up by about a half a stop. And I think that's about where I ended up. And that ended up with a much more printable, it's 3/4 of a stop. That ended up with a much more printable image, printed on metallic paper, and it really pops. So that's about it. I've talked a lot. My audience of one, Rebecca, do you have any? Oh, looks like Dave joined as well. Let me allow Dave to join. Hi, Dave. No, oh yeah, there he is. Dave, I just promoted you to be a panelist. Welcome.
Oh, Oh, there you go.
I'm sorry, I didn't see you. I didn't hear you join, so that was rude of me. But,
Yeah, I finally got in, so. But yeah, no, I caught a little bit of what you said.
okay. Well, I was recording the whole thing, and actually, we're still recording, so you can watch it afterwards. I'll figure out with Troy how to post this.
Okay.
But that's basically the thought process. Let me stop sharing, and at this point, I'll switch the recording off. This has been Nick Smith for IEPPV, talking about how to process a light painted subject. Good night. I hope you enjoyed watching this and have fun.